Hi, my name is Winston, and I live in Ukraine. I wanted to talk today about Patreon and why we have to boycott it. I want to talk about all the companies you should boycott and why. I've recently posted on Facebook at length about Intel recently and why they directly and indirectly finance the slaughter of Ukrainians. However, as I was collecting my thoughts today, in the wake of overwhelming silence to my multiple previous exhortations to boycott companies that operate in Russia, I realized that we need to talk about collective responsibility in further detail. I thought about trying to separate these topics. However, I decided to keep them together rather than split them apart for the sake of digestibility or some such idea. I think Patreon serves as an important example and an easy point of entry for the larger discussion about the frameworks that undergird both the collective responsibility of Russians for this war, as well as our collective responsibility to boycott companies that continue to operate in Russia. The we, in this case, being members of a group who claim to stand with Ukraine, or dare I say, citizens of the earth. Now, I know such a long video doesn't behoove the algorithm, especially where I stand. Well, most people are not going to take the time to watch this. Most people just want to doom scroll and maybe toss a like or a sad face on someone posting about the horrors of Ukraine. Most people don't want to educate themselves. They don't want to know what's going on, and they definitely don't want to actually act in a way that could help. And digging into this apathy is part of why this video is so long and not just limited to me explaining boycott Patreon. All right. So, here we go. Let's start by talking about Patreon. We have to boycott Patreon. I know that this one stings. It's easy enough to stop buying Nestle products or PepsiCo products. That's not too hard. But it's a little more awkward to give this one up. Fortunately, there are a plethora of other crowdfunding websites, and some don't even take a cut like Patreon does. I don't check me on whether or not these ones take a cut, but I know just off the top of my head, there's Buy Me a Coffee and Ko-Fi and Memberful and Substack. The list goes on. So as we pull our money from this service, we have to encourage these creators we were supporting to phase out the use of Patreon and to start using any of these alternative means of income. But let's back up. Let's meet Jack Conte. I think Conte is how you pronounce his last name. I don't know. Jack is the founder and CEO of Patreon. Jack has a killer beard. Patreon is the most popular crowdfunding website worldwide, and it allows creators a means for direct income from their respective audiences rather than through ad revenue and some other service. Jack is also the keyboardist for the phenomenal funk bands Scary Pockets and Scary Goldings. Their music is really great, seriously. So, Jack seems like a solid dude, right? Well, unfortunately, Jack's company, Patreon, continues business as usual in Russia. Now, Patreon is unique among the international companies that continue to operate in Russia because Patreon doesn't exactly operate in Russia the same way that someone like Nestle or someone like Procter and Gamble does. Because Patreon doesn't pay taxes to the Russian government, which is basically just an extra strike against these other companies. But Patreon has its own means of supplying the Russian government with taxes, which is Patreon provides a way for Russian creators to make income, of which Jack, of course, gets a cut. So what's the problem? Why does it matter that Patreon allows Russians and Belarusians access to its services? Jack is just providing a means of generating income. How does that facilitate the genocide of Ukrainians? The answer is really very simple. Russian citizens pay taxes. 33% of Russia's federal budget for 2023 is explicitly dedicated to financing their war against Ukraine. And this figure doesn't include all the money dedicated to financing propaganda about the war for Ukraine. That is in addition to the 33% just dedicated to killing Ukrainians. So, any person or any corporation that pays taxes to the Russian government is financing the slaughter of Ukrainians. That is not contestable. That's a fact. A fact that Funky Jack either doesn't understand or just doesn't care about. And unfortunately for Jack and for us, neither is excusable. But let's be fair. Has Jack acknowledged his role in financing genocide? Well, sort of. Yes, but not in the way that you'd wish he had. In response to early sanctions by the US after Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022, Patreon, like most US companies, was pressured to cease its services in Russia and Belarus. But old Funky Jack released an official statement on March 16th, 2022 in response to this pressure. And I'll link it for you. And for those of you unwilling to remove your ad blocker to view the article, I will summarize it. Jack Conte adamantly defended maintaining the support to Russian creatives. To pull out would be antithetical to one of Patreon's central tenets and motivations, to help creators continue to be creative. Oh, Jack. Jack claimed that he does not want to, quote, penalize Russian creators for the misdeeds of their authoritarian leader. Here's where we have to really get into it. This is a very asinine take for multiple reasons. We have to take a step away from Jack and Patreon now and delve into the issues that underlie Jack's very, very shitty decision to remain there. Number one, Jack's take falls into the trap that so many people still seem to just trip into. The false notion that this is Putin's war, not Russians' war. Number one, it's factually incorrect. And number two, it's a disingenuous and precarious framing for both current and future global relations with the Russian nation-state. Number one, in terms of being factually incorrect. Most Russian citizens vehemently support the invasion of Ukraine. And also, it is Russians who drop the bombs. It is Russians who pull the triggers. It is Russians who torture and rape Ukrainian children. It is Russians who burn libraries and museums. It is Russians who deliberately just blew up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, deliberately flooding cities and fields, knowingly poisoning the Dnipro River and the Black Sea. It is Russians who are, as I am recording this, preventing evacuation from that same flood that they created and shooting at the people that are evacuating. This is not Putin doing this. This is Russians doing this. Also, Russians are paying taxes to support this. So, it's factually incorrect to say that this is Putin's war. Now let's turn to the more, or rather, the less obvious way that talking about Putin's war and Russian apologism is a problematic framework. The framing is dangerous for two chief reasons, I feel. Number one, it facilitates the perpetual future of the Russian Empire. You heard that right. And two, it literally aids the financing of this genocide in the present. To talk about this genocide as Putin's war dismisses the notion of collective responsibility, which is an elemental constitutive condition of being a part of any community or society, be it as vast as a nation state or even the whole human species, or as small as a friendship between two individuals. Members of a group are complicit in the actions of that group. Even if a given member does not herself affirm the actions taken by the group, by her being a member, by performing the behavior that is required to maintain membership, in this case, for example, living in a nation state and paying taxes to its government, she is not merely guilty by association. She is complicit. She is responsible. It feels almost silly to have to break it down this much. I mean, we already understand collective responsibility in some sense, right? If you're out in town with two of your buddies, and said buddies, they're walking along and they point to some guy walking nearby and they say, hey, we're going to go beat the shit out of that guy. And you silently nod or just look away, and then they proceed to go beat the shit out of that guy, then you are complicit in that guy's assault. Like, period. I'm not talking about whether it's a given country or city's court of law would hold you accountable. I'm saying like look at me here. You would be responsible. You're not as responsible as your buddies for the assault, but you are responsible. Period. So let's abstract a bit. A group only persists by virtue of the constant collective performances of membership by its individual members. The group in question today is the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire only persists because its members, that is, citizens of the Russian Federation, collectively and constantly perform this nationhood. And make no mistake, the Russian Empire is alive and well. Russia's colonial legacy deserves its own essay, but for our purposes, we need only look back 3 decades. Russia, that is, the Russian Federation, is an imperialist nation-state. Since the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the Russian Federation has invaded 5 sovereign nations: Georgia, Moldova, Chechnya, Ukraine, and Syria. Russian citizens have to come to terms with their imperialist past and present in order for all of us to avoid a Russian imperialist future. To speak of, to even think of the ongoing genocide of Ukrainians as Putin's war silently preserves the status quo, where collective responsibility is ignored, where Russia is allowed to keep colonizing, subjugating, genociding, and ecociding other sovereign nations. It ignores the reality of the very much alive Russian Empire. But how does this, number 1, facilitate the perpetual future of the Russian Empire, as well as, number 2, finance the ongoing genocide of Ukrainians today? Let's tackle number 1. How does this facilitate the perpetual future of the Russian Empire? It suggests, this talking about Putin's war, suggests that the world can go back to normal and resume trade with Russia once this ongoing genocide finally ends. Despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of international companies that operate in Russia continue business as usual despite the war, there are many who have scaled back or stalled investments or have even been so bold as to suspend operations. For example, Apple and Adidas. However, these companies that have suspended operations or have scaled back both want and intend to resume business there once it is politically acceptable for them to do so. I want to read now an extended quote by Marichka Buchelnikova. I'm sorry for butchering your name. I will link her Instagram, who has already articulated to this point much more effectively than I can. So this is her. By framing the war as Putin's war, we falsely hope for a fresh start with post-Putin Russia. Instead of pushing Russians to face their imperial attitudes and revise them, we hope that Russia will magically get wiser after Putin. And it won't. It never did. If we truly want to end the war against Ukraine and prevent Russia's future invasions against sovereign states, we have to pressure Russia to finally start decolonizing itself. That's why we have to take up the approach of collective responsibility. Most of the democratic world, this is still her, most of the democratic world understands that only the complete fall of Putin can end this war. However, they are yet to understand that even the fall of Putin's regime will not be enough to end this and many other Russia-instigated wars for good. The Russian Empire must die. The Russian world must fall apart. Russia's worldview and self-perception must fall into a deep crisis. Only out of complete defeat and the resulting social crisis can a decolonized version of Russia emerge. We shouldn't be afraid of a humiliated Russia. In fact, we should be much more afraid of a quick return to business as usual with whoever comes after Putin. Collective responsibility can help Russia change. Collective responsibility, if applied properly, can be one of the crucial instruments to change Russia and the war in a just way. The concept doesn't imply that Russians should be hated or discriminated against because of their ethnicity, not at all. It should give a framework for the entire Russian society, starting from the intellectuals and prominent Putin opposition leaders, to take ownership of their state's actions and start an honest dialogue about Russia's past, present, and future. But, concluding with her quote, where do we start? To begin the meaningful kind of change, let's start by acknowledging the collective responsibility of Russians and Russian imperialism for the invasion of Ukraine. And by refusing to accept the simplified Putin's war narrative. Also, next time you hear a Ukrainian or a Georgian or a Kazakh or a Pole or an Estonian or anyone who has experienced Russian imperialism firsthand saying that all Russians are responsible, try to listen to what else they have to say instead of immediately labeling their thinking as xenophobic or emotion-driven. This is at Buchelnikova, everybody. Do yourself a favor and follow her on Instagram. Everything she posts is just top tier. So I want to return to a statement that I made earlier about the status quo and the ubiquity of this lack of accountability, lack of insistence on collective responsibility. I believe that this is a particularly important point for any of my fellow Americans out there. All of this talk about collective responsibility can and should absolutely be applied to citizens of all nations. It is a constitutive element of being a citizen of any group, period. This includes the unequivocally imperialist nation-state, the world cop, the United States of America. I don't want anyone, especially Americans, to come away from this thinking that a citizen having internalized imperialism and failing to take responsibility for her nation's shitty policies, shitty imperialist past and present, and many, many shitty war crimes is something that is unique to Russia. However, right now, Russia is the one genociding Ukraine, so that's our focus. So, first, we talked about why it's not only harmful, but literally not even factually correct to call this Putin's war. Second, we talked about the failure of Russian citizens to take collective responsibility for the actions of Putin. We talked about why maintaining the frame of Putin's war and the actions of their authoritarian leader, to quote Jack Conte, will only ever encourage, or at best never discourage, this failure to take responsibility of imperialism and genocide that is literally happening right now. Now, let's lastly turn our attention to our collective responsibility. We who stand with Ukraine. I stated previously that a group only persists by virtue of the constant collective performances of membership by its individual members. I'll now expand a little on that. I believe that the meaning of such membership, what it means to be a member of a given group, is defined by those performances. I'm pulling on Judith Butler here a bit, and I haven't read her in a while, and I honestly never even read much, but you should go check out some Judith Butler talking about performativity. So given this, and given the previous discussion on collective responsibility, I don't believe that what I'm about to say is controversial. I really don't. What it means to be Russian today is to be imperialist. What it means to speak Russian today is to speak the language of colonization and genocide. What it means to be Russian today is to support the slaughter of Ukrainians. And I'll say this in all fairness, what it means to be American today is to be imperialist, To be American today means to be content to drown in the rot that spills from the top down and content to bathe in the decay that festers in every institution that was built on, facilitated, and continues to perpetuate the systemic inequalities of race, gender, and class. And before you bring out your pitchforks, I want to remind you of what I said earlier. Collective responsibility does not mean that everyone is equally responsible. I know that there are and have always been individuals and sub-American collectives of all sorts and sizes who have sought and seek and act to upset the status quo. I'll even go out on a limb. I don't feel good about this, but maybe there have been Russians who have similarly done so. But a collective is defined by the performances of all its members. Quantity usurps quality in this case. So what does it mean then to today, on day 472 of Russia's genocide of Ukraine, what does it mean to stand with Ukraine today? What does it mean to stand with Ukraine today if you do not take a few minutes out of your day or your week or your month or ever to boycott the companies that are financing the genocide of Ukrainians that you supposedly condemn, let alone even share that information? Share it with anybody else. I stand with Ukraine today means nothing. It means empty words, lip service, hot air. Today, on day 472 of the war, to stand with Ukraine means you're not standing with Ukraine. You're paying lip service to a horrible spectacle that you don't want to look at. It means you are quite literally scrolling on by. But here's the crucial takeaway. Things do not have to remain this way. This was Buchelnikova's whole point. By changing our performances, the performance of membership in a group, by behaving differently, we can indeed take collective responsibility for the failure of the majority of those who condemn the war to actually do anything to condemn it other than just merely saying those words. We, those who stand with Ukraine, can take responsibility for our collective failure to take very simple and very straightforward steps to boycott the companies that very clearly contribute to the Russian war chest that is literally being used to fund the slaughter of Ukrainians. Okay. Whew, let's zoom back out. Or back in, I guess, toward Patreon. Let's discuss briefly why boycotting companies that finance the genocide can and will actually help end the genocide. There's 3 reasons. Number 1, if Russian creators lose a primary source of income, they will be more likely to protest the war, probably. If, for example, Procter & Gamble, that is an American company based in Cincinnati, Ohio, by the way, stopped providing sundries throughout the Russian Federation, imagine how much more protest there would be. Civil unrest is crucial for a coup. It is the soil necessary for what Buchelnikova called a framework for the entire Russian society to take ownership of their state's actions. The inability to get paid and thereby sustain yourself in a capitalist society creates a pretty significant disruption to the status quo, a deep societal crisis that Marichka referred to. Russian creators, that was number 1. They lose income, they're probably going to riot. Number 2, Russian creators pay taxes to the government, every third ruble of which goes to finance the slaughter of Ukrainians. By choosing to remain and pay taxes, Russian citizens finance the slaughter of Ukrainians. It's doing math. And number 3, corporations, e.g. the aforementioned Procter & Gamble, pay the Russian government the equivalent of millions of dollars every year in taxes. Therefore, Procter & Gamble, they have Ukrainian blood on their hands. They know about it and they don't care. So at last, let's return to Jack Conte and why we need to stop using his website Patreon. why we need to publicly shame Patreon and Jack, and to actively encourage the creators that we used to support via Patreon to use alternative services because of Patreon's role in this ongoing genocide. What our bearded buddy Jack either doesn't understand or doesn't care about, and hint, I think it's the latter, is the above-mentioned point. Number 2, that Russians pay taxes. Those taxes fund the war, Jack. It's not hard. I like your music and I like your beard. I bet you're a cool guy. But none of that matters. You are facilitating genocide by helping Russians make money. Sure, you're a lot less responsible for it than Procter & Gamble, who pay millions of dollars in taxes directly to the Russian government, but you're still contributing to the same problem. You're just one person back. You're still a middleman for this. And your motivation for doing so, which is allegedly to support creative people, which I think you believe that you're doing, this doesn't outweigh the harm that your support for Russians is doing. So, in conclusion, how to act, how to boycott Patreon. Number 1, stop supporting your creators on Patreon and your memberships and delete your account. But before you do that, explain to your creators why you are compelled to do this. Number 3, encourage your creators to phase out their use of Patreon as they phase in, and encourage use to their other patrons to use an alternate crowdfunding source. I have drafted a template letter that you can feel free to use that I will post in the description or a pinned comment, whatever will fit it. This is what I sent to the people I supported on Patreon, and they were all surprisingly very understanding. I guess not surprisingly, they're good people. That's why I supported them. Anyway, this is like a doable thing, guys. So anyway, number 4, tell your friends to follow suit. Explain why this is important. Number 5, tell Patreon and Jack Conte to stop supporting Russians. I will link how you can contact them below. Number 6, visit leave-russia.org. That's leave-russia.org, all lowercase, and all lowercase, Jesus. Visit that website and boycott every company on there that continues business as usual. Then encourage companies that you see are on the scaled back or suspended operations lists to completely exit Russia. Then, number 7, share that website with your friends and encourage them to do the same. Just a few minutes a day, one company a day. And lastly, bombard the social media sites, their YouTube videos, anything and everything, with the message to the effect of, you are financing genocide of Ukrainians, and by continuing operations in Russia, or leave Russia immediately. I will not buy your products or services until you do. This is however many days too late, but late is better than never. Something to that effect. Okay, this is almost half an hour. I'm sorry that this took so much time, but I appreciate your time. And Slava Ukraini.